Hi chess fans, long time since the last video. We are looking at the game between Vasily Ivanchuk and Vishy Anand, played in 1991 in Lineares. This was the tournament that Ivanchuk won, beating Kasparov, Anand and Karpov, and this is the game against Anand. Let's have a look. Vishy played e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, c takes, knight f6, knight c3, a6, the Najdorf, very popular at the time and still today. Bishop c4, e6, castle, bishop e7, bishop b3 going back, castle, f4, b5. Very typical moves, and now in this position f5. Have a look at this position. What is the purpose of this move? And what might be some problems of this move? So first of all, white is threatening to take, opening up the line for the rook, and the central knight here on d4 is nicely supporting this. The problem with this move can be seen in the game. After the move e5, this pawn becomes a little weakness. So what Ivanchuk played is first b4, kicking the knight, because if takes, simply loses a piece. So this is a nice interim move, knight a4, and then e5. And now a lot of the game is dictated by the pawn structure, in this case the pawn on e4, which is now backwards and weak. And the cons of this pawn is that it can be easily attacked with various pieces. Also the queen can come behind, can go to the a8 square, and all the pieces can coordinate to attack this pawn. And on the other hand, this pawn is this pawn is opening the possibility for the white pieces to attack the king. So again, continued knight to e2, bishop b7, attacking the pawn, knight g3. Now, next question, should black now take this pawn? It's only protected by the knight here on g3. Should white, for example, play knight takes e4? What do you think? So Ivanchuk played knight to d7, knight b to d7, so he didn't take. So let's have a look. After takes, white can simply retake and then play queen to g4, attacking the bishop and the g7 pawn, and it's most sensible here to protect the bishop and close off this diagonal. And then in this position, bishop h6 threatens mate, queen takes, and if the pawn advances, we win the exchange. So the only move is bishop to f6. And in this position, white can take, bishop take forced, f6, bishop g6 forced, and in this position, white can improve the position further, attacking the pawn, which can only be protected by advancing, which opens up in a forced way this diagonal. And white can increase more pressure on this pin here, provoking h5, which is another weakness. And in this position here, black is a pawn up, but the pieces are not really so active. This piece is pinned, the king is weak, whereas the strong bishop, the queen, and the rooks are coordinating against the attack, and it's easy to see that black will win at least a pawn. So this position is less clear, and this is an important lesson maybe for us. Instead of going into an unclear position, Ivanchuk is choosing to continue to increase the pressure before taking the pawn, because this is a weakness. We can simply develop our pieces before we go on attacking this weakness. Game continued, queen to e1, bringing the queen into the attack. a5, c4. This is an interesting maneuver because taking here activates the knight. And potentially this also cements the weakness here on d6. Usually in the Sicilian this is not necessarily a weakness because it can be easily protected, but Now it's harder to see how this pawn can advance. Game continued, queen to e2, rook fc8, bishop g5, knight c5, rook ac8, h6, bishop e3. Now, should white take now? The pawn again is en prise. Can black actually take the pawn on e4? Spoiler alert, the game continued knight c to d7. Can you imagine why Ivanchuk didn't take the pawn but played the knight back? Let's have a look at the candidate moves. If the c knight takes, this opens up the fork on the two rooks. The bishop dropped back here to allow this tactical motive. If the f knight takes, keeping this knight here, blocking this diagonal, this simply hangs a piece, because after takes, we can exchange and the queen takes a piece. So, and taking with the bishop is just a transposition, because bishop takes and knight takes gets us into the same position. So in essence, black cannot take the pawn, interestingly enough. So Ivanchuk drops back. So this e4 pawn seems to be a recurring theme here. Okay, bishop f2, rook a6, rook c2, queen b8. You can see the queen is navigated to a8 to increase pressure on the pawn. Rook e8, queen a8, queen d3. So you can see it's not so easy actually for white to keep protection of the backward pawn while at the same time launching an attack on the king. That's why this f5 move here, if you look in the database, actually black scores very well, because white doesn't really have so many plans and black has a very clear target on the e4 pawn. The game continued, knight to g4, knight to f1, knight df6, knight d2, knight takes the bishop, king takes, bishop c6, rook c to c1. So in this position here, black can gain a positional advantage. Can you imagine how? So have a look at this king. Is the king better to be hidden away behind pawns in this position, like this king here, or is it better to be centralized? Okay, black can play queen a7 here, attacking the king, and there's nothing really to block this diagonal here so well, because queen runs into the knight check. And the queen also attacks this square here, so the king is forced into the open. And in this position here, this king is actually a weakness. So after these moves, the engines quickly drop for a sizable advantage for black. Let's have a look at this position here before rook takes c2, because you could ask, wasn't it possible to play queen a7 immediately here? Simple answer is yes, it was also possible here, even though it's not so strong, because after king to f1 there is still the chance of the rook to come in and protect the king, which is a little less so after rook to c1. Okay, so black now has a little bit of an advantage, but how to convert it? The game continued, rook d8, bishop d1, and now there is the move of the game, really interesting move. Ivanchuk in this tournament, by the way, in his game against Kasparov, played a lot of similar ideas that look the same as this idea. So if you know this game, maybe you can also get an idea of what's going on here. How can black in this position actually gain a big advantage? Okay, another tip. the motive here is that black king is weak in the center, that white's king is weak in the center, and that all of the pieces are kind of passive. So think about what do you do in a situation like this. And also in the Sicilian, there's one typical move, which is very typical, topical in the opening. It's a pawn move. Okay, the phenomenal move here is d5. Okay, looks crazy because after c takes, as happened in the game, I mean, what has black gained? The point here is that black sacrifices a knight, and after rook takes d5, suddenly all of the lines and all of the diagonals are open. I mean, look at this. There is this great diagonal for the bishop here. There's this great diagonal for this bishop here. There is the diagonals for the queen. There is the lines for the rook. So it's really everything, all the black pieces are opening up on the weak king, and all of white's pieces are simply bad. And let's have a look at the game continues, and then we go back to this position and maybe try to learn on how we can identify such a motive in our own games. So the game continued, rook to d5, and rook takes d5, attacking the queen, and turns out no matter where the queen goes, we can take advantage of the open lines and the diagonals. So let's have a look if black tries to bail out and exchange the queens. If white tries to bail out and exchange the queens, we can take, and in this position the simplest is bishop g5 check and winning the knight, leaving black with a huge positional advantage, and material is even again. So black is already a pawn up and will be up more pawns. If the queen instead goes forward, it actually has few squares. So attacking the queen is already, unless the queen goes back, which allows again open files such as rook to bishop to b5, and then nasty things happen. If the queen takes here, the queen attacks the rooks drop backs, and you can see all the pieces coordinate into a mate. If the queen goes to c2, the bishop pair again is deadly. After bishop to g5, taking advantage of the open diagonals, knight to e4, bishop takes the rook, winning the exchange, and then bishop b5 take, rook f3, rook d3. Everything is collapsing down on the king, and we have won back the material. In the game, Vishy played queen to b3, which allows an attack on this knight here. And Vishy tried to protect the knight. So far so good, everything looks good. But if you want to have a look on how black can win here, bishop takes, rook takes, and then knight to b5. The king is forced back. The queen and the bishop dominate the diagonals, so the king can only go here. And rook takes, it didn't happen anymore in the game. Vishy resigned after bishop takes d2 already. Black is winning again. And the king is just extremely vulnerable. So in this position here, again, how can you see d5? Well, I looked at this and I tried to learn from it, and I was thinking, okay, I need to, so all these pieces and the weak king tell me the motive, which is I need to open up the position. Okay, so then, then I can ask myself, how do I, I'm sorry, there we go. How can you open up the position? Well, one way to open up the position is always a pawn push. And in this case, you just have to calculate what does this sacrifice do. And in this point, black in this position has 6 pawns, white has 5 pawns, and we know that you can sack a piece, which is worth 3 pawns. So one thing that you could do is and ask yourself, will I be able to win back at least 2 pawns in this position? And if you calculate until here and you evaluate this position, you can come to the conclusion that the queen has to move, and you can think about, you know, maybe I can win this pawn, or another pawn. You can think about, yeah, I probably have very active pieces against the king, and white does not have so active pieces, so maybe I cannot mate, maybe I cannot win a material advantage, a very big advantage, but I can probably at least win back 2 additional pawns. So this is maybe one way how you can, if you calculate until this position, which is possible from here, you know, d5 takes is relatively forced, is one way that could allow you to evaluate this position correctly. But then again, for full correct evaluation, you of course have to weigh the vulnerable king with the extremely active bishops and rooks and queen, who all have open diagonals and open files. This dynamic advantage by far outweighs the material disadvantage. So the engine here gives an advantage of -7 for black. Okay, I hope that you enjoyed this game. See you around next time, and happy chess. Bye bye.